From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Sam Kean. Sam is a science writer, as I'm sure all of you know. He's written several very well-received books. One is The Tale of Dueling Neurosurgeons. Another one is The Disappearing Spoon. They have been named among the top science books on Amazon in the years they came out. He has been published by just about everyone, from the New York Times, The Atlantic, to Slate. And his new book is called Caesar's Last Breath. And if you haven't read it, it's much like his other books. It makes science hugely readable. And with no further ado, Sam Kean.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining me this evening. So there's an old joke about two fish that are swimming along in the ocean, and they, just talking, hanging out, and they pass by an old-timer fish. And as they pass him, the old-timer fish says, "Hey, boys, how's the water today?" And the two fish just kind of nod and keep going, and then about a minute later, one of the young fish turns to the other one, and he says, "What the heck is water?" Now, that's not a very good joke, I admit, but there is kind of a truth in there, in that, the fish are so immersed in water that they have a hard time even realizing what water is. And I think human beings are in a lot the same relationship with the air around us. It's always around us, but it's invisible, it's ubiquitous, but we barely pay any attention to it. And so that's kind of the premise of my book, Caesar's Last Breath, which is to make us pay attention to the air, make us think about the air in a way that we really wouldn't otherwise. And I think it's important to be aware of the air because it is something we really take for granted. It might have been the first fact you ever learned in science class, which is that, some things are solid, some things are liquid, and some things like air are gases. And we pay a lot of attention to the solids and the liquids in our life. But the gases are really the most important thing around us. Because think about it. If you could go, if you had to go without solids, without food for a few days, you'd probably live, you'd pull through that. Without liquids, you could go, maybe a week or so, you'd be okay. But without gases, without the air, you'd maybe last a few minutes at most before you'd die. Air is really the most important thing in your environment right now, and yet it's something we barely pay attention to. And so the premise of the book was to imagine taking a deep breath, inhaling, exhaling, all of these different gases. Things like nitrogen, oxygen are the big ones, but there's also things like little bits of anesthesia. There are noble gases, there's ozone. There are pollutants, there are refrigerants, there is radioactive fallout from 1950s weapons testing that is still in the air around us. So the book examines the origins of all of these gases, and it tries to tell kind of a funny or a spooky or a touching story about each one of them, and how it shapes our lives in hidden ways. And there's actually something kind of bigger connecting all of these different gases too, kind of the overarching story of the book. And that is, if you look at these different gases, some of them come from the very first days of planet Earth. They're billions of years old. Some of these gases only came about later with the rise of life. Some of these gases only came about with the rise of human civilization, so they're very new. And if you look at all of these gases in tandem, kind of the whole ensemble of gases, you can actually get a complete history of Earth. In fact, you can reconstruct the whole history of our planet every single time you take a breath if you know how to decode those stories that are in those gases. So I thought I would take a few minutes tonight to try to share some of those stories with you, and to try to get you to be aware, be more, try to have a better perspective about what it is you're breathing. So I'm going to start with a very early planet Earth and talk a little bit about the early atmospheres on Earth. And you sometimes hear that the atmosphere is the most complicated system that we know of besides the human brain. And it's true, the atmosphere is a very, very complicated system. And like a living thing, the atmosphere has evolved over time. Our air has changed throughout Earth's history. So the very first atmosphere we had was just some hydrogen and helium that was left over from the formation of the sun. It was a very thin atmosphere, very wispy atmosphere. I call it sort of a comb-over atmosphere on our planet. Wasn't very substantial, wasn't really fooling anyone. And very quickly, it got blown away into space and disappeared. But that was our first atmosphere. It was just made of this hydrogen and helium left over from the sun. Not long after that, we got our second atmosphere. And the second atmosphere, the air above us, actually came from the ground beneath us. It came from volcanic vents and fissures and other things on the early Earth. Early Earth was a very dynamic place, lots of volcanoes erupting all the time. They would spew out these hot, nasty, reactive gases that would then go up, and they started to build up and form our first atmosphere. You had things like hydrogen sulfide, the rotten egg smell. You had ammonia, and you especially had carbon dioxide building up. And if you were to get into a time machine and go back to this era, kind of step out, try to stretch your arms a little bit after your journey, take a nice deep breath, your lungs would just start burning inside you. This is very, very nasty air to try to breathe. It would have destroyed your lungs, basically. So this was not the kind of air that we wanted to, breathe that was really supportive of life. It was from volcanoes. If you've ever been around a volcano eruption, something like that, you can imagine it's not very pleasant gas. But that was our second atmosphere, was from these volcanoes, the exhaust that would come out of volcanoes. And so our third atmosphere kind of took over gradually from the second atmosphere. What happened was, all these hot, nasty gases would spew out. But there was one component of the eruptions that would kind of sneak in there all the time. And that component was nitrogen. So nowadays, nitrogen's a dominant component of the air. But with each one of these eruptions, you'd get a little tiny, tiny bit of nitrogen, just a very small percentage that would sort of seep out with each one of these volcanic eruptions. But what would happen is that all these other hot, nasty gases, the carbon dioxide, the sulfur dioxide, the ammonia, they would go off and they would start reacting with things, and eventually they would disappear. They would fall out of the air. But nitrogen is a very unreactive gas. It's very hardy. And once nitrogen gets into the air, it stays in the air, and it stays in the air for a really, really long time. Millions, sometimes even billions of years. So when the nitrogen started leaking out, it would stay in the atmosphere. But then, you'd have another volcanic eruption. All these hot, nasty gases would come out, but they would react, they would disappear, and you'd get a little bit more nitrogen. Then you'd have another eruption. All the hot, nasty gases would come out. They would react, they disappear. You'd get a little bit more nitrogen. And it kept building up like this very, very slowly over the years. And when I say slowly, I mean very, very slowly, like the ultimate slow and steady. It took a few billion years for this process to happen, for nitrogen to finally build up to appreciable levels in the atmosphere. But after a few billion years, nitrogen became the dominant gas in our atmosphere. Now makes up about 78% of our air, so about 4 of every 5 molecules we breathe came from these volcanoes ultimately. And we really should be thankful for that because it allowed life to form and exist on land. If we still had all that volcano exhaust around, there would be no way we could support life on land because the hot, nasty air that was around would just destroy it. So we really should be thankful for this volcano exhaust and the little bit of nitrogen because it made life safe for creatures like us on land. So that was the third atmosphere with nitrogen. And eventually that gave rise to the fourth atmosphere, which is the one we have today. And the fourth atmosphere, the additional gas that the fourth atmosphere had in it was oxygen. Oxygen is an important gas, obviously, for us, and it's kind of weird to think about the fact that oxygen wasn't always a part of Earth's atmosphere. And in fact, life arose on Earth well before the first oxygen existed. And that's really strange to think about, because nowadays we associate oxygen very, very closely with life. It seems vital for life. But in truth, oxygen was actually toxic for most forms of life that existed on early Earth. Oxygen was actually a poison for these creatures, microbes and things that were around at the time. And the reason why is that oxygen is a very reactive gas. Once oxygen started to get inside these cells, it would come across these delicate biochemical structures they had, enzymes, other things. And chemically, oxygen is basically a big bully. It goes in, it starts punching things, ripping things apart, destroying things. And so these microbes, when they had oxygen inside them, it would basically destroy them. It would rip everything apart inside them. So what these creatures, these little microbes would do is they would actually expel oxygen. They would get rid of it the way that we get rid of carbon dioxide. They would breathe it out and let it go into the atmosphere. And that worked fine for them for a while, but unfortunately, enough of these little critters started building up where the oxygen levels started rising in the air. And once they got to be an appreciable level, they started to have some problems, some big problems. It would be like nowadays if all of a sudden a bunch of chlorine gas started flooding the entire Earth. You can imagine we would have a lot of problems breathing because it would sear our lungs. It would start to destroy the structures inside of us. It was doing the same thing to these microbes, the oxygen was. And eventually it built up to such a high level that it started wiping out huge swaths of these creatures. And geologists can go back and they can see evidence of a mass extinction that was caused by oxygen. It was called the Great Oxygen Catastrophe. So kind of this big, big event that happened, all because of this gas that nowadays we associate very, very closely with life. But eventually, though, our ancestors, these microbial ancestors, did learn to harness oxygen. They learned to tame it. And what they did basically was they started treating oxygen the way that we treat plutonium in a nuclear power plant. So plutonium is a great thing to have, a lot of energy it can give off, but you have to keep a very close eye on the plutonium. You can't just have plutonium sitting wherever you want inside one of these power plants. You have to keep it very tightly confined to certain areas. And our cells eventually learned to do this with oxygen. They would harness it, you kind of keep it in a confined area. But once they did that, they realized, wow, oxygen actually can do a lot of things. It's very reactive, very energetic. And once you learn how to harness oxygen, that's when you can get creatures that can do cool, interesting things. Creatures that can run and jump and think. Creatures a lot like us. So without this oxygen, we could have life on Earth, but we definitely wouldn't have the complex, dynamic life that we have today. Oxygen, this poison, is really what enabled Earth to support creatures like us. And nowadays, oxygen makes up about 21% of our atmosphere, so about 1 of every 5 molecules we breathe is an oxygen molecule. But that number has actually kind of veered up and down a lot over the history of the Earth, the past few 100 million years. At some times in Earth's history, it's dropped to as low as 15%. And when oxygen is just at 15%, fires actually have a really hard time starting out in nature. Even things like lightning strikes and volcano eruptions really can't get fires going when oxygen levels are that low. And in fact, geologists, when they look at the geological record, they see no evidence of any widespread fires anywhere in Earth's history until just a few 100 million years ago when oxygen levels finally built up high enough where the atmosphere could support burning. So without oxygen, we wouldn't have fires around either. So that was when oxygen was at low levels, but at other times it's risen higher, much higher, something to like 35% of the atmosphere. And when oxygen levels are at 35% of the atmosphere, you can imagine that fires burn wildly. Even dropping 2 rocks, having a little spark or something go off, all of a sudden you have this huge conflagration with fires burning everywhere. So when oxygen levels are that high, it's kind of a dangerous time to be alive. It's also kind of a creepy time to be alive because oxygen levels affect the evolution of certain animals in a kind of unusual way, especially the evolution of insects. So unlike us, insects really don't have lungs. So they don't, we have lungs. We breathe air in, it dissolves the oxygen into our blood, and our blood takes it around to our inner cells, our inner organs. Insects don't have lungs that work quite the same way that we do. Instead of having lungs that inhale air, what they have are these little holes or the little pores on their skin. And so the oxygen just kind of has to passively diffuse in through their skin. And that works fine for them, it's okay, except if the insects start to get too big, this passive process of just letting oxygen flow in, the insects actually struggle to get oxygen to their deep interior cells. And that's actually why insects are always so tiny. If you've ever wondered, we have big birds, we have big lizards, we have big mammals, why can't we have really big insects? Well, the answer why is that it's because of their inefficient breathing process. They have a lot of trouble getting oxygen to their inner cells if they get too large. But if oxygen levels rise higher, if they rise to, say, 35%, well, all of a sudden you can get very, very large insects suddenly. And they have seen in the fossil record, you can get millipedes that are a yard long. You can get dragonflies the size of seagulls. You can get spiders the size of car tires. Or who knows, someday we might even find bigger spiders out there in the geological record. We don't really know the limit on how big these insects could have gotten. So we really should be thankful, I think, for this nice, even kind of balance we have of oxygen at about 21%, because we get things like fires, we get the warmth, all that stuff, but we don't have the dog-sized creepy crawlies running around either. It is a nice balance that we have. So in summary, that was our 4 atmospheres. And if you were paying attention there, you might have noticed that I said, well, the nitrogen makes up about 78% of our atmosphere. And the oxygen makes up about 21% of our atmosphere. And if you add those two together, that is already 99% of our air. And so you might be thinking, well, that other 1%, it probably can't do a whole lot, right? Like it's just kind of 1%. It's probably not that important. Well, not so fast. The analogy I like to make is with a glass of wine. So a glass of wine is well over 99% water molecules and alcohol molecules. But if you think a glass of wine is just water molecules and alcohol molecules, you're crazy. There are the overtones of wine. There's the finish. All those other things in that 1% are what make the wine wine. And it's really the same way with our air. That 1% is vitally important. It gives the overtones and the finish to our air. For instance, all of global warming, all of it, comes from that 1%. All odors, all smells, all scents, things like perfume, barbecue sizzling, fresh baked bread, all of that comes from that 1%. We would be vastly poorer without that 1% of our air. And for the last story tonight, I'm going to look at one of the gases in that 1%. It's a gas you've probably had in your home at some point in your life. It's one of the more important gases in the history of civilization, for better and often for worse. So this story is a story of rival inventors. And these inventors were working on home appliances. And like most stories of rival inventors, it's a story of winners and it's a story of losers. And I'm going to get to the winners in a moment, but right now I'm going to focus on the losers. I'm going to especially focus on the big loser in this story. It's a man you might recognize, kind of famous historically, the big loser in this story. So get ready to boo, get ready to hiss. Yep. Albert Einstein. Now, of course, we don't think about Albert Einstein as a big loser, and we definitely don't think about him as a home appliances guru, but in this story, he was actually both. So one morning, 1926, Einstein is reading the newspaper when he almost choked on his eggs. It turned out that an entire family in Berlin, including several children, had died because of their refrigerator. Refrigerators back then used poisonous gases as coolants, things like ammonia, methyl chloride, sulfur dioxide, and unfortunately, they often had spotty motors with bad seals on them. The seals would crack, they would break, these toxic gases would leak out into the apartment, and if it was tightly sealed enough, it would suffocate everyone inside. And unfortunately, this was a kind of common occurrence. And so Einstein called up a scientist friend of his named Leo Szilard. You can see him in the picture here. And he had kind of this lump in his throat, and he said, there must be a better way. And it turned out there was. So in the book, I get into a little bit more about the details here, but just briefly, this is how a refrigerator works. So imagine taking a casserole, putting it in your refrigerator to let it cool down. If you were to tear the inner panels off of your fridge, you would see a series of tubes inside there. These tubes have a liquid inside them that has a very low boiling point, which means it turns into a gas very easily. And as your casserole starts to give off heat, the liquid in the tubes absorbs the heat, starts to boil, turns into a gas. And that's good, because having a gas gives you lots of different options. For one thing, gases are really, really good at absorbing energy. So they can suck up a lot of heat from this casserole. The other great thing about gases is that they're mobile. They can move very easily. So after the liquid turns into a gas, it starts to float away inside these tubes. And eventually it winds its way behind your refrigerator. And if you've ever been behind a refrigerator while it's on, you might have noticed that it's a little warm back there. It can get a little hot in the back of your refrigerator. What's happening is that the gas that has taken the heat from inside your fridge is now dumping it out back. The warmth is coming from the gas dumping heat. And that's basically the art of refrigeration, is the art of manipulating gases to take heat from one place inside the fridge, move it to another place outside the fridge. So that's basically how refrigerators work. Now, to work continuously in a cycle and to keep things cold over a long period, eventually the fridge has to turn that gas back into a liquid. And here's where Einstein saw the problem. One of the tricks that refrigerators use to turn gases back into liquids is they use a compressor. Basically, it's just a piston that squishes the gases down. It applies pressure to them. If you've ever heard the hum of refrigerators, that's the compressor. That's the motor running the compressor. But unfortunately, as I said before, motors back then had bad seals on them. They would crack. All these gases would leak out. They would kill people in the apartment. So what Einstein did and his friend Szilard, they came up with some alternatives. And actually, they came up with 3 different types of alternative refrigerators. The first one they came up with was a very small-scale refrigerator. It still used a gas and a liquid as a coolant, but it was actually powered by tap water. So you would turn on your kitchen sink, and it would power this little tiny refrigerator. Very innovative, very interesting. Einstein thought it would be for poor families, ones who couldn't afford a full refrigerator. And it had this long kind of metal wand coming out of it. And what you did is you took your mug of water or beer or whatever, and you took this wand and you plunged it inside the mug, and it would cool things down very quickly. And again, Einstein thought this would be great for poor people. It would be very widespread in Germany and Europe. And so he came up with a great name for it. He called it Der Volkskühlschrank, which means the people's fridge. And I love that name, the people's fridge. So that was the first one, was the people's fridge. Very simple device. The second refrigerator that he and Szilard invented went the complete opposite direction in that it was this super complicated, intricate device. Had all these valves and pumps and cooling lines in it. There were these huge electromagnetic coils in it. It was pumping molten sodium up and down during part of it. As you can imagine, this was a little bit impractical for your average kitchen in the 1920s to have these huge molten sodium pumps kind of running around in it. So it never really had any use as an appliance, but in a few decades after that, it actually found use in the nuclear power industry, where they would use it to cool some nuclear power plants. So even a few decades before nuclear power existed, Einstein and Szilard had invented a way to cool the plant. So that was kind of interesting. But the third fridge is the one they really thought was going to be the big hit. It had 3 different gases inside it that it used as coolant, so a very intricate system there. And it was powered by methane, by natural gas. And the key part about this refrigerator is that it had no motor. It didn't use any electricity, so it was completely silent. And because it had no motor, there was no weak spot. There were no seals to crack and break and start leaking toxic gases out into your apartment. They could seal everything up very tightly behind thick sheets of metal. So this refrigerator they invented was suddenly very, very safe. And now at this point you might be thinking, I mean, come on, this is Albert Einstein, like the guy who invented relativity. How much time was he actually spending dinking around on refrigerators? And the answer is, well, kind of a lot of time. Again, he and Szilard invented 3 different types of refrigerators, and they filed for patents for them in several different countries. And as you can imagine, there were a lot of patent lawyers in these countries who were a little surprised. They would get the patent for, this new type of refrigerator. They would start flipping through it, and then they would come to the signature line, and they would say, wait a second, Albert Einstein? That Albert Einstein? Well, sure enough, it was that Albert Einstein. He'd already revolutionized our concept of space-time. Why not revolutionize our concept of home appliances? It makes perfect sense. And there was another reason Einstein was very interested in these refrigerators, kind of an age-old reason, and that was money. Albert Einstein needed money. He was living in Berlin between the world wars when inflation was completely out of control. At one point, a loaf of bread, just a single loaf of bread, cost 1 billion Deutschmarks. So inflation was out of control. The economy was in shambles. Einstein needed money. He'd also sort of recklessly divorced his first wife, married another woman. He had 2 families to support, so he needed some cash quick, and he really thought that these refrigerators were going to be his meal ticket. But there was just one problem, those rivals that I mentioned before. Because it turns out a few chemists at General Motors in Michigan were messing around in the lab one day when they invented a new gas called Freon. Turns out that Freon had a very low boiling temperature, so it could cool things like casseroles very well. It was very cheap to make, so that's always good. And it was completely non-toxic. So refrigerator makers could keep their old designs. They didn't have to switch to this fancy Einstein design. They could keep their old designs, swap in the Freon, and things would work just as well. Because, your motor might break down, the Freon might leak out into your apartment, but it was completely non-toxic, so it didn't matter. So no one ended up using Einstein's design. Nothing ever came of it, and it never ended up in anyone's home, unfortunately. And this would have just been kind of a curious footnote to the life of Albert Einstein, except for one thing. That magical Freon gas, as you can see here, the atoms inside of it are chlorine atoms, fluorine atoms, and carbon atoms. It is a chlorofluorocarbon, a CFC. And if there are little hairs rising on the back of your neck right now, that is for a good reason. Remember the hole in the ozone layer? Well, CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons like this, were the ones that ate the hole in the ozone layer. People would take their refrigerators, they would dump them in junkyards. Eventually, something would puncture the tank. All these chlorofluorocarbons would leak out. They would go into the atmosphere, and they would start gobbling up all of the ozone there. They are responsible for the hole in the ozone layer. And most people don't know it, but chlorofluorocarbons are also horrendous greenhouse gases. Molecule by molecule, they absorb thousands of times more heat than a molecule of carbon dioxide does. CFCs account for just parts per billion of our atmosphere, so very, very small parts per billion. But they also account for a full 1/4 of all human-induced global warming. So the world could have saved itself a heck of a lot of trouble in the long run if we'd just gone with Albert Einstein and the people's fridge. And that kind of brings us full circle here, because at the beginning of the talk, I was, mentioning volcanoes, how they were spewing up these hot, nasty, reactive gases into the atmosphere, things like carbon dioxide. Well, nowadays, we're putting carbon dioxide and some other kind of nasty gases back into the atmosphere. Our air has changed in the past, and it's changing again. The air is not the same air today that our ancestors breathed 250 years ago. And it's probably not going to be the same air that our descendants breathe 250 years in the future. We could be seeing the emergence of a fifth distinct atmosphere. And I spoke before about how you can inhale the history of the world every time you take a breath. Well, in a lot of ways, that history is still being written. Early change was driven by volcanoes, then later by microbes. Nowadays, it's human beings. We've inherited a big, big responsibility, and as a result, the air is kind of a controversial topic nowadays. And again, we pay more attention to solids and liquids than we do gases, but I hope that people in the future have the luxury to take air for granted as well. But the first step to preserving air is understanding the air, to notice the air. To notice those little stories flitting around in front of you, coursing into and out of your lungs every time you take a breath. You have to make those invisible stories visible, the way your breath is visible on a crisp November morning. And I hope the talk tonight, and I especially hope Caesar's last breath, can help you do that. Pure air is odorless. Pure air is colorless. And by itself, it sounds like nothing. But that doesn't mean that it's mute, that it has no voice. Air is actually burning to tell its story, if we just listen. So again, thank you all for coming out tonight. I appreciate it. Okay. Yep. And I think we have time for questions, if anyone has some. A little hard for me to see, but okay, right there.
Story ideas from?
So she asked where I get the story ideas from. I pray every night for new story ideas. I don't know. They come out of nowhere. With the books especially, though, what I try to do is I want there to be a central scientific topic. I wrote a book about the periodic table, about the human genome, the brain, the atmosphere. But I want to be able to branch out into a lot of different things. I don't want to just be confined to sort of the science or the lab work or something like that. So I want to make sure there are really good stories out there, and that's really what I focus on. I'm looking for drama, conflict, heroes, villains, things like that. And beyond that, about getting the details and things, it's just a lot of reading, a lot of hunting through footnotes, and reading as widely as I can. Reading fiction, reading other genres, things I maybe wouldn't think I'd be interested in, just picking them up, reading them, and seeing what pops into my head.
How did you get the idea for this book?
For this book, a few different things. I'd heard a few stories about the atmosphere, things I wanted to get into, like the Einstein refrigerator, things about different gases. And then just knowing air is a controversial topic. It's topical nowadays, people are interested in it, but we really do take it for granted. So that ability to kind of make people appreciate, to see the air, and then the stories in there was an appealing combination. Oh, we'll go there and then. I heard him. If you can just tell me, I can repeat it as well.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. Never thought, I'd never heard of Einstein being involved in the refrigeration business. That's a new story. But one of the good story, the climate change has been all going in the wrong direction. We hear horrendous stories day after day, things are bad. One of the good stories was about a couple of months ago, there was a report that the ozone layer over the North Pole or wherever has shrunk dramatically. Could you talk a little bit more about that? And the other question I have is, the atmosphere extends up to 20 miles, is that how it is above the Earth?
So yeah, the atmosphere it depends on kind of where you want to cut it off, because there are different layers in the atmosphere. So it depends on where you want to cut it off.
Just a hypothetical question: is there a way? I mean, since if our atmosphere is so polluted, is there a way to interact with the layers above to clean up things?
Okay, so I'll take the second one first. That would be hard because the atmosphere is much thicker down here, so it'd be hard to get that turnover going. And I think the pollution would just kind of eventually work its way down. So I don't think that would really work. But you do make a good point that there are, some good things going on in the atmosphere too. The air we breathe nowadays is a lot cleaner in some ways than the air we are breathing, 20, 30 years ago. So we have done a very good job of getting rid of a lot of pollutants, things like that. And the ozone layer has started to come back in some cases. In some areas it has shrunk. We've provided that cover again. So there are good stories out there nowadays, a lot less acid rain, for instance, things like that. But there are other things we're still struggling with a lot too. So it's kind of improving in some ways, not improving in others. So there's hope out there.
One reason for the ozone layer shrinking is the elimination of CO2 from aerosols.
Eliminating CFCs is one reason, and then ozone builds up naturally in the air. So if you just give it time, eventually it'll start to form more. Yep.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. In your sort of ooze to zoos account, shall we say, you mentioned oxygen suddenly appeared on the scene. I never quite heard where it came from, but my understanding is it came from plants.
So oxygen, when it first started to appear on the scene, actually came from microbes.
Right.
Yep.
But the photosynthesis process.
It was photosynthesis.
Yeah, it's a type of plant.
Yep.
Where did they come from?
Where did they come? So the microbes appeared fairly early in Earth's history, and then eventually, no one knows quite what happened, they got the ability to photosynthesize. So it was just a long process of, incremental steps where they finally built up the chlorophyll molecules, got the ability to photosynthesize, and then they would expel the oxygen as a pollutant. Yep.
Thank you.
Yep.
With the pollution we got with the fuel we use, the fossil fuels, and then we have all the animals and stuff, it seems like a lot of people are suppressing the information that fossil fuels are causing a bigger problem than the methane gas that the animals produce with, the greenhouse gas thing.
Yeah, I mean, both of them are contributing to it, but fossil fuels and, vehicles and industrial production, cement production actually produces lots of pollutants. So there's lots of industry things going into it, yeah.
But what I'm saying is that I think we need to concentrate on the aspect of the animals and the methane like that. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, cows and other domesticated animals do produce a lot of methane. And there are people who are trying to fix it. You see, I saw these pictures the other day of cows with big backpacks on them where it was trying to suck up the methane that they produce. You can imagine where all the tubes went. But yeah. There are people working on this problem, or probably a more realistic solution is to add something to the feed that can help break the methane down, or the methane is produced actually by bacteria in their gut. So if you could have another bacteria that could break the methane down, there are scientists working on the problem.
I was curious, how did you come up with your title?
Well, I didn't come up with some of the titles for the books. With this one, I can actually go to that slide if you'd like. So actually, it's kind of a classic problem for physics and chemistry students. They ask them, what are the odds that you're breathing right now a molecule that Julius Caesar breathed during his last breath when he got assassinated? And your first thought might be, well, that seems impossible. There's no way any of Caesar's last breath is still around. I mean, he died over 2,000 years ago, and anything he exhaled would have just been smeared around the entire atmosphere. The atmosphere is so big compared to a breath that the answer has to be zero. It has to have disappeared by now. But if you start to look at it and like drill down to the nitty-gritty details, it turns out that there are so many molecules in every breath we take. There are 25 sextillion molecules. It's a 25 with 21 zeros after it. There are so many molecules in every breath we take that you start to maybe think, well, that's a lot of molecules. Like maybe some of them are still around because most of them were nitrogen molecules, which, as I mentioned, stick around for a very, very long time. So the question basically comes down to, well, which is going to win? That really big number or the really small number, which is how big one breath is compared to the overall atmosphere. And it turns out that if you do the math, go through all of it, those two numbers cancel out almost exactly. And it turns out that every single time we take a breath, we inhale about one molecule that Caesar did during his last breath while he was being assassinated. So we have this direct material connection to someone like Julius Caesar every single time we take a breath. We are still inhaling the same air that he did. And, it doesn't have to be Julius Caesar either. You can talk about Amelia Earhart or Confucius or Jumbo the giant circus elephant. Like any creature that ever lived and breathed in the history of planet Earth, we are still inhaling the same air that they did. So air is one thing that really unites all of human beings, and it really connects us to our past in a direct material way. So that's why I chose it as the title story for this book.
Thank you.
Do we have time for one more? We'll do one more, all right.
I'm just wondering about how the atmosphere is changing. It's changing global warming, but how does it affect us, our evolution? Changes in the environment.
How does it affect our evolution?
How would it?
Okay, and I should say, I'll be around for a few minutes afterwards. So if you're too shy, you have a burning question, I'll be sticking around for a little bit at least. How it affects our evolution? Well, it probably hasn't affected our evolution too much yet, but you could imagine it in the future affecting our evolution in some different ways. If pollutants start to build up, we are going to have to become resistant to those pollutants. If the temperature increases a lot, we're going to have to be more resistant to temperature. If water becomes scarce, we're going to have to be better at, being dehydrated, things like that. You do start to see evolution of human beings in air with people who live on mountaintops in Tibet and other places. They have an enhanced ability to breathe in, or I should say they have a more efficient breathing process. And they also have some other biochemical changes that you can see directly in their genes because they've just had to adapt to living at higher elevation. So if we have to escape to the mountains someday because it's too hot at sea level, could be another adaptation we have. So you probably will see some changes in human beings over the course of the next few millennia, unfortunately. So, but again, I think that's it. But thank you all for coming out. I appreciate it.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.